Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. This is Mia Walker with Payroll Partners, and we are just now starting the webcast at 2 o'clock. We're going to give everyone just a few minutes to log in, so please join us. We do appreciate you being here and on time. We're going to give everyone a few seconds to log in. While we're doing that, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, feel free to go to the chat box. It should be on the right-hand screen of your webinar login box and go to questions. I'm sorry, go to chat and you can chat there. Please send it directly to me or one of the facilitators, and then we will be reviewing those questions at the end for anything that hasn't been covered. If you have something very specific, of course, John and Brian are happy to reach out to you directly and answer those questions for you. Also, there is a handout that I'm going to be going over for payroll partner services. It is attached if anyone's interested, but it's not necessarily needed to look at. And I hope everyone's having a beautiful Tuesday today. Thanks everyone for joining us. If anybody wants to turn on their camera and say hi, you're welcome to do that if it will allow you to do that. I know we're probably all getting a little tired of these virtual meetings. They're not as personal. So I think sharing our faces along with our voices definitely helps. So we appreciate it.
Looks like Mia's on mute here, so I'll go ahead and kick us off if
Thanks,
we're good to get
Brian.
started.
Yeah,
All right, all
thank
right,
you. Too many buttons. So now I
understood.
think we've got everybody on and working. Thanks for joining us. Again, this is Mia Walker with Payroll Partners, and I've got Brian Boffman with PSK and John Anthony with the Anthony Law Firm Group joining us. And we're going to go over some really basic, I think, and practical financial procedures that you can go through to protect your organization. They're both going to be speaking on those topics today. Feel free to enter your questions into the chat box and send those to me privately. I will go over those and present those to everybody at the end. And I hope everybody enjoys the presentation. I will be speaking with everybody soon. And Brian, I'm going to let you lead the way.
All right, thanks, Mia. My name is Brian Boffman. I'm a partner with a CPA firm called PSK. We're a public accounting firm. We do audits, accounting services, taxes, all that kind of fun stuff. I've been in that space for about 17 or so years, and really appreciate the opportunity to spend some time with you all today. Particularly enjoy getting the opportunity to tag team this with John Anthony. John and I have worked together on a lot of different mutual clients over the past, and so I think I will enjoy the opportunity to be able to co-present along with him today. We're going to kind of kick it back and forth over the next few minutes as we talk about these four different areas. We're going to talk a little bit about internal controls. We're going to talk about some employment practices. We're going to talk about cash flow management, and then John will finish up with some governance considerations. So you can go on to the next slide there, Mia. As we go through each of these areas, we're going to talk about general tips. We're going to talk about some age-old things that haven't changed, for a long time with regard to each of these areas. And then we're also going to, kind of lay in some some overlay from COVID and this experience that we're in now where we all find ourselves working, in remote environments and doing things differently these days. And so we will, mix in some things to keep in mind as we find ourselves again in these new environments. So to kick it off, I'll talk first about internal controls. And so what are we talking about when we talk about internal controls? And they're right on the next slide. So we're basically talking about measures that we put in place to help ensure that no one within our organization can commit fraud. And then equally important, we want to put measures in place so that nobody in our organization can be accused of committing fraud. So we don't even want there to be, the appearance or the, possibility that, one person has too many controls in place and could have accusations made against them. So this is not a fraud seminar, so I don't want to go too deep into the fraud stuff, but I will at least mention there is a thing called the fraud triangle, and it basically, it talks about three things that are always going to be present when fraud is committed, when financial fraud is committed, and it's opportunity, it's pressure, and it's rationalization. So those three things are always going to be in play when we have financial fraud. The pandemic has definitely influenced, some of these things. The amount of pressure that people are under has increased as of late. There may be job loss in a household. There could be just the pressures that come with kids being at home and our daily routines being disrupted. Medical bills, for those who have been sick, could be on the rise, and so the amount of pressure that people are under has risen. I think that's fair to say. Our ability to rationalize could also have increased. In terms of rationalization, thinking about a mom or dad who's having a hard time putting food on the table for their kids and having a hard time providing for their kids. That could, that's kind of the ultimate rationalization that would cause an otherwise reasonable person to do something that they never would have thought that they would do. Really, the number one way that a lot of people rationalize committing financial fraud is by initially they don't in their mind think they're gonna steal. They're gonna temporarily borrow, but then they're gonna pay it back. And so a lot of times when people first commit a fraud, they think that this is just a temporary thing. It's going to get me through. I'll give the money back. And that's the kind of the initial way that people rationalize things. So when it comes to that pressure that people under, when it comes to their ability to rationalize their behavior, as an employer, we can't do as much about those things. But the opportunity, that's where we as an employer really have the ability to curve or to hedge against, people's ability to commit fraud by just taking away the opportunity and not putting them in a position to where they, even have the ability to commit fraud. John and I have worked together on a lot of different situations where there's been fraud committed or accusations of fraud. And there's a few things that are always in common. Number one, I'll speak on behalf of John and myself both when I say it's never a fun situation to work through that. It doesn't matter what the dollar amount is, if it's, $5,000 or $50,000 or $500,000, it is a bad situation. There's people's reputations at stake. There's emotions running high. It is a bad situation. Another thing that's common is the organizations who become victims of fraud never would have thought that they would be subject. They never would have anticipated themselves being at risk. We think that fraud is something that happens to other organizations. It's something that happens to, would never happen to us. We never would think that we would fall victim to that. And then thirdly, one thing that's common is you normally the person who commits the fraud never would have anticipated themselves doing anything like that. A lot of times when there's fraud in place, somebody is in a bad situation. Again, there's medical bills that are mounting. There's some kind of addiction that's in the mix. There's usually there are times when somebody's just, a bad person and they want to do a bad thing. But a lot of times, you have what would otherwise we would think of to be reasonable people that are put in bad situations, and then, the unthinkable can happen. So again, kind of enough about that. So how do we control those opportunities and take them away? It's by having, good internal controls. I'm going to talk about, a few different things that we can do. The first is a bank reconciliation. A bank reconciliation is one of the best ways that you can mitigate and keep from, falling victim to fraud. A bank reconciliation, first and foremost, when that's done on a monthly basis, it ensures we know how much cash we have, which that's important for any organization. Number two, it makes sure that every single transaction is accounted for. When the bank reconciliation is completely done, we know that all the activity that's gone through the bank account has been captured in our financial statements. So making sure it's done on a monthly basis is imperative. Ideally, that bank reconciliation would be done by somebody other than the day-to-day accountant. That's not always, feasible in small to mid-sized organizations. So if it's not, and if your normal accountant is the one that's doing the bank reconciliation, make sure there's a second set of eyes on it by somebody who is a little bit removed from the day-to-day accounting. And when that person's looking over that bank rec, make sure it's done first and foremost. Look at the outstanding items, checks that haven't cleared, deposits that haven't cleared, something like a deposit in transit. If there's a deposit in transit that's been sitting there, unreconciled for more than a few days, that's an indication of a problem. And so, the bank reconciliation kind of is grand central station to where, all cash comes in and out. And it's a great way to make sure we can have some oversight over all the activity. In addition to the bank reconciliation, just having some good controls over disbursements is a good idea. I'm on that next slide there, Mia. So generally speaking, we know that, most of the time that we know that the accountant, the day-to-day accountant, should not be the one signing checks. We find that to be the case with most organizations that we work with. That's kind of a general rule of best practice. What we don't always think about is, even though the accountant's not a signer on the checking account, they may still have the ability to initiate electronic payments. And so when we're, setting up the different user authorities for our online bank accounts, we want to make sure that, we manage the user authorities and don't give the accountant full on access to be able to do everything. They definitely need read-only access and need to be able to see reports and see activity. But if your accountant's not going to be a signer on the bank account, we also need to make sure that they don't have the ability to initiate online payments. Purchase order systems are a great way to introduce some controls. A purchase order system can look, a few different ways, but the general principles are going to be that before any, purchase is made over a certain dollar amount, maybe $200, $300, $400, $500, whatever the amount that's right for you. But before any purchase can be made, the employee who's going to make the purchase has to send a request to their supervisor, and their supervisor is going to look at that request and approve it. And then the purchase would be made, and then an invoice will come in. Invoices should always be routed to the business office or to the accountant. The accountant can match up that invoice against the request for purchase, and then put that all together and then give it to the CFO or whoever is ultimately the signer on the account. Again, great way to make sure that you have approvals and authorizations in place, when it comes to purchases. That's also a great area to automate things. So there's platforms in place these days that will allow everything I just described to happen without paper in an automated fashion, to where requests are made online, approved online, invoices come in or stored electronically. and that can really serve someone well who has employees working in a remote environment. Our clients that we're working with that already had those type of systems in place, back last February, they really found some benefit from that as people went home and had to start working remotely, but we still had the ability to keep the integrity of our approvals and authorizations in place, even though people were working from home. Next thing is credit cards. Think about credit cards and have some good policies in place for how credit cards work if we are going to give our employees credit cards to make purchases. As John would attest, some of the fraud situations that we've worked in, could have been avoided altogether if there was just a little bit more accountability in the way that employee credit cards were working. First and foremost, we need to make sure that all credit card charges get captured in the system. So we want to reconcile the credit card reports just like we do the bank statements. Make sure employees turn in expense reports and give documentation, not only receipts, but provide some, the business purpose behind whatever the purchase that they made and what made it, constituted it as a, something that the employer should pay for. We want to make sure that the same purchase order, parameters are in place with credit cards as are with other charges. And so if there's going to be requirements to, get pre-approval for a $500 purchase to be made by check, we want to make sure that the same pre-approvals are in place for credit card charges as well. This is another great area to automate. And so again, there's platforms in place that allow employees to, snap a picture of a receipt and as soon as they incur that charge, and the application can pull information from the receipt and put together a nice expense report. It can really help out your accounting team and your business office, so they get a nice PDF of, with pictures of all of the receipts and all of the charges, as opposed to getting, a bunch of wadded up expense receipts that have, been in somebody's back pocket for 2 weeks and things like that. And so another great way to automate. And then the last area of controls I'll talk about before I kick it over to John is in the way of payroll tax deposits. And so, and this is an area where if you have outsourced your payroll to a third party and you have a third party payroll provider like Payroll Partners who is handling, the withdrawal of money or the withholding of money out of people's paychecks and sending that to the IRS, you've done yourself a great solid if you have that in place. If you haven't, and if you're handling your payroll yourself, really looking over just simply making sure that the money that gets withheld out of people's paychecks finds its way to the IRS. Seems like a simple thing, but it's a very common area where we see fraud taking place, where money's withheld out of people's checks, but it doesn't find its way to the IRS. It finds its way to a bookkeeper's bank account or to be paying expenses on behalf of a bookkeeper. Because it takes a fair amount of time before the IRS gets around to sending notices that lets you know that your payroll taxes are late. And then when the notices are sent, they often go to the accountant who's the one who misdirected the money. And so it can take years even before the IRS actually just comes in and levies a bank account. And by that time, the person who committed the fraud is long gone. And so just simply making sure that the amount of money that was withheld out of people's paychecks, which can be seen on a payroll report, making sure that money actually finds its way to the IRS by seeing cleared amounts on a bank statement, will do yourself a big favor there. So anyway, speaking about payroll, I'm going to kind of kick it over to John here. Just a brief intro on John. Again, we've worked together for a long time. He's an attorney that works with a lot of small to mid-sized organizations, as well as some big ones too. Works in the for-profit space, nonprofit space, really pretty versatile background there, and definitely a very, very solid understanding of just the core kind of legal concepts that are going to, be involved in any business. And so, John, I'll kick it over to you, and you can go through the employment practices.
Thanks, Brian. One of the things that I want to say about what you mentioned earlier is that whenever there's a change in process, we find that a couple things happen with fraud. Either fraud starts when there's a change in process, or fraud is discovered when there's a change in process. Not always, but I'm saying that that's the time, that's the period when we have those events the most. And so over the last 9 months, the process for a lot of us has changed. And so you really kind of need to have your ears and eyes tuned to looking for, is fraud occurring, or have we just discovered it? Because it's during those changes that when it's going to be most readily seen. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the employment side of things, especially during the last 9 months, what we expect to see. Over the last 9 months, I've had a lot of employee situations arise. A lot of it has come down to whether it be layoffs, but also a lot of job changes, job description changes, people asking to be laid off so that they can file for unemployment, people not wanting to take the change in their job descriptions. I've had several situations where maybe you had employees who traveled internationally for a job. Now their employer is bringing them back to say, hey, you need to focus domestically. Employees being unhappy with that, and the employer is asking, what can we do about it, if anything? So I'm going to talk through a few things that kind of prepare you for this, and also some things that you make sure you don't want to lose. So, a couple things that have changed over the last 9 months is there seems to be a sense of rush now with employment situations. There seems to be this idea that we've got to hire, and we've got to hire fast. For whatever reason, the typical timeline for choosing an employee has been shortened greatly across all of my clients. Now they're wanting to hire fast to change with the pandemic. One of the things we heard from every motivational speaker and every business coach and every consulting firm in March and April and May was, you've got to pivot. You've got to pivot. And most of us are trying to figure out what the heck that means. But for a lot of these guys, it meant hiring the right people for the right situation. The other thing that changed is they were looking to hire technologically savvy employees now. Now it's no longer good that the employee understands what their job is. Now they need to understand how to work cloud-based software. They need to understand how to work over Zoom, how to work remotely. And so technology has come into play more than ever. So here's some things. I'm going to go through kind of the selection process here, some things for you to be thinking about with those considerations in mind. The first one is, don't forget about the application process. Actually having your employees fill out an application. Really big companies are good at this, going to their employment portfolio. We've all seen the jokes and probably been through the process even maybe of uploading your resume and then manually going in and filling everything out after you've uploaded it. So they're really good about this. The small and medium-sized organizations, the nonprofit organizations, not so much. Usually we forget to continue having an application process even when we're remote. So this is your first bite at the apple of listening to what the applicant is telling you. You can ask questions on there that you want to know the answer to. And we all know that there's rules about what you can and can't ask. If you're confused on those, you need to contact your attorney and they can help you out. But you can ask, is there anything that would keep you from filling this job? Are you able to work remotely? Are you able to come into the office when that's time? Maybe people are taking jobs thinking, I'm going to be able to work remotely forever, not realizing that a day is coming when we are going to want to go back into the office. The next thing is about screening. Don't forget during this process, you've heard Brian talk about the importance of checks and balances, having integrity in your process. The screening is just as important. And it's very important to remember that you don't want to pass this up. You may be in a rush during this time to hire. You may think you know the person. They may be a friend of a friend. Don't forget that screening, those reference checks, those background checks, those criminal checks. Those are very, very important. Then another aspect that I'm seeing missed a lot are the basic forms that we know about for employment. I'm sure payroll partners and others can help you with this. But those I-9s, those W-2s, don't forget to get those out of the way sooner rather than later. For some reason, not working together in an office, people are forgetting about the basic paperwork. And that leads us to the next two items, the employment agreement. And now what I'm seeing more of is this telecommute agreement where, hey, we have a basic employment agreement that we need individuals to sign. They can sign it remotely. Electronic signatures are valid. You can even get things remotely notarized now if you want to. So don't let that convince you otherwise. The other thing that I'm seeing, just a side note of the employment agreement, is really across all agreements. If you're sending them out and it's electronic, I am seeing more and more times where somebody sends out an agreement and it gets altered on the other side and then signed and sent back, and the person who sent it is not realizing that it was altered. So anytime a contract goes out from one of my clients, is signed and brought back, I immediately compare the documents, even if it's just been a quick signature. And this has been an issue for me over the last 9 months. So don't forget those employment agreements. Don't forget to review them before you sign them. And then the telecommute agreements. What are those? What do they say? This may be new to you, but I'm finding more and more clients are wanting to use a telecommute agreement. We're saying, hey, you had a job in the office. You were here 9 to 5, Monday through Friday. Now we're allowing you to work from home. You need to sign this telecommute agreement. It says you're going to be available. It says you're going to upload all the antivirus and anti-malware software on your computer, that you're going to have the appropriate technology to be able to work from home. And then also I'm seeing some that say, hey, working from home is not a substitute to childcare. Now, this is a hugely sensitive topic with schools being in and out. So I would really encourage you, if you want to do something like this, handle it gingerly. Do not take a hard stance right off the bat, but make your policy known, enforce it, and enforce it equally. Anything you do not enforce equally among all of your employees can become evidence for a type of discrimination later. So if you are going to take these stances, do so equitably. Another thing to think about is I've had clients, international organizations, that have said, you know what, we're not going back to an office environment. You can work from anywhere in the world. That's up to you, as long as you're available. And this can also mean just being available during your time zone, Central Standard Time Zone, 9 to 5. You need to be available. You need to be answering emails. I don't care where in the world you are. And so if you're that type where you have employees who are now spreading out around the country or around the world, you need to be thinking about that availability because it can be very difficult to work with someone in a different time zone when they are not operating the time zone with most of the employees. So that's just something to think about. For your current employees, think about your training. What do you need to do to continue training them? Is there compliance training? Is there sexual harassment training? Don't forget that even though everybody's remote, you still need to operate all of your training programs. If you need help with that, help developing or trying to figure out what to train on, contact them training. They can give you a list of things that you need to work on. The next thing that you need to do is make sure you're enforcing your policies, especially around financial and data protection. Using the cloud, make sure people are not keeping all of the information on their desktop, on their computer. They're actually using the cloud software that you're supposed to be using. Employment reviews. Don't forget those employment reviews. Those are very, very important. And Brian and I have seen this before where, you try to go to fire an employee for something and you go to, and the attorney says, show me all of their employment reviews. And you've got 20 years of exemplary employment reviews. Be honest on those employee reviews. It'll help the employee improve, and it'll help you avoid a situation later where you're trying to terminate an employee for cause and you have no evidence. And then train them on their availability. You want to know your employees are working. Years and years and years ago, I had an employer when I had just gotten out of law school that when I worked from home, miraculously, I would get an email or a phone call at 8 o'clock in the morning. He tried to be coy about it. He tried to act like it was just out of the normal, but I knew what he was doing. He was wanting to make sure I was sitting at my computer ready to work at 8 o'clock in the morning. Be upfront with your employees. Tell them what you're expecting from them, and go ahead and talk to them about their availability. And another point on that I want to make is if you have hourly employees, you got to be keeping their time. So think about that. All right, so here's some other considerations on working from home that I've been dealing with this week and even the week prior is people getting confused with pay time off, Family Medical Leave Act, and disability. We're working from home. We all think we're Superman. We all think we're Superwoman. We can do it all. So I can have my surgery on my knee and take my pain meds and still answer my email because I'm sitting in my recliner at home in front of the TV. This is something you've got to keep track of as an employer. And twice now I've had this come back to bite employers, clients of mine, where they let somebody do that, where they let somebody work impaired or not really be available, but say they were working, have surgery, and they just kind of turned a blind eye to it, and they didn't do that good of a job, and they were only available for an hour a day. And then 6 months later, they end up getting COVID, or a family member ends up getting COVID, and now they've got to actually take 12 weeks off. And the employer's saying, they already did this. And I'm saying, no, they didn't. You let them work. You knew they were sick. They knew they were sick, and you didn't draw that line in the sand. And so you need to make sure you're taking care of this and watching it. Same with disability. You need to be able to help that employee make that decision, let them understand that disability is available. And if they need to take that, then you need to talk to them about that. So there are some things to think about. I'm going to kick it back to Brian now, talking about cash flow.
Yeah, those are great points. I see even, within running our business that, it seems like working from home has become the new catch-all. I'm not feeling good. I'm going to work from home. I'm sick. I'm going to work from home. I'm going to have surgery. I'm going to work from home. My kids are sick. I'm going to work from home. And so from an employer standpoint, trying to draw the line and keep track of that it's a tall order. It's not easy to do. I think to your point, having some good policies in place and consistently enforcing those policies will give you a fighting chance. Okay, switch gears a little bit. We're going to talk about cash flow management. So cash is critical for everyone, no matter what size organization you are. Cash is pretty essential, particularly for small to mid-sized organizations. It can be it puts an exclamation point on the need to manage cash, because it's harder. It takes more time for small to mid-sized organizations to raise capital. A lot of times larger businesses, almost with the press of a button, can wave a wand and access more money if you need money for whatever purposes. But for small to mid-sized organizations, we all know that is not the case. And so we have to figure out how to do the best we can managing the resources that we have to work with. So how do we do that? We really, I think the number one thing that you need to do is know what your minimum operating cash need is. That is an amount that is, you can look at the beginning of the month after you've, set aside money to fund your payroll for the month, and the majority of bills have been paid at the beginning of the month. There's a dollar amount that every organization has that you need in order to kind of get through to the next month. Because for most of us, money comes in at various times throughout the month, it goes out. And so, most any business owner will know, if I have payroll funded and I have the majority of my bills paid, and if I need $100,000 in the bank in order to float through to the next month, or maybe it's $300,000, or maybe it's $500,000 that you need in the bank just to float through the normal operating cycles of your business or your nonprofit organization over the course of that month. And so know what that dollar amount is. If you're sitting there and your cash need is $300,000, and at the beginning of the month you have your payroll money set aside and bills are paid, and you have $400,000 in the bank. Okay, you have $100,000 extra. So let's think about moving some of that aside, setting it over into a savings account. If you're a business that does distributions, that can give you the amount of money that you might be able to distribute to owners or investors for that month. If your cash need is $300,000 and you're sitting there and you have $200,000 in the bank, you know, okay, I'm gonna need a plan for the month. I'm gonna need to figure out how I'm gonna navigate through this month. So I'm gonna have to cut some expenses. I'm gonna have to move some expenses out a month. I'm gonna have to do something to manage cash. And so know what that minimum operating cash need is, and then manage it on a month-to-month basis. So there on the next slide, Mia. So once you know that, forecast how, on a monthly basis, forecast on a quarterly basis, what that quarter is going to look like in terms of what we anticipate coming in and what we anticipate going out. If cash is going to be tight, you're a lot better served if you know that on the front end and you can develop a plan for how to manage through it. Particularly if you're in a seasonal situation or a real cyclical business, doing a forecast, on a monthly or quarterly basis in terms of what is going to happen from a cash standpoint is very important. Distinguishing between fixed and variable costs. When we're budgeting or when we're forecasting, there are some types of expenses that are going to be paid no matter what. Payroll. Particularly for our, exempt salaried people, that's going to be the same dollar amount, every single month. Our utility costs, our loan payments, those things don't vary greatly. And so they are what they are. And then there's other types of costs that will vary depending on levels of productivity, depending on, some expenses you just have a choice. You're going to pay it this month or pay it that month. And so distinguish between those regular reoccurring monthly expenses that are fixed and then those other costs that are variable. They need to kind of be looked at in two separate buckets. Consider the need for a line of credit. Lines of credit are very, very customary in all types of businesses. There's a general premise out there that you have to spend money before you make money. If you're going to build a house, you're going to have to go buy supplies before you can get started building it and then later recoup the payment for selling it. And so in order to have that money to front the upfront cost that comes ahead of making the sale, then a lot of organizations will rely on a line of credit. Line of credits are, very, very good business tools. The key with a line of credit is, it needs to be revolving. What you draw one month, to upfront those costs needs to be paid back. And so if you find yourself, your line of credit, getting bigger and bigger, that's kind of turning into a loan that you're using to fund deficit operations. But if a line of credit, if you draw and you pay back and you draw and you pay back, that can be a very, again, good business tool. Plan for large purposes, plan in advance so you can set money aside to pay for those bigger one-time things, which is kind of a good segue into the next slide there. Think hard about debt. A good general rule of thumb, I think, when it comes to debt is if you're considering going into debt, that debt needs to be used to facilitate growth. Debt costs money. And so if you're going to go into debt to buy something, that something, whatever it is, needs to provide you with the ability to do more business or to make more money. You don't want to go into debt simply to be able to afford nicer stuff. You want to use debt as a tool to grow your organization. This is a great time to review loan terms for existing loans. Interest rates are obviously at all-time lows right now, and so if you have a mortgage or if you have a loan on a large equipment purchase that you made a number of years ago, pull out that agreement, look and see what the interest rate is. It may be such that you can refinance it now and take advantage of a more favorable rate. While interest rates have dropped, property values in a lot of cases have gone up significantly. And property is one of the number one pieces of collateral that collateralize business loans or mortgages. And so it could be that if the value of your collateral has increased, that may allow you to be able to restructure the note agreement to get more favorable terms. If you have a lot of, financial covenants in there, they may be able to remove them or loosen those covenants if your collateral has increased significantly in value. So, start a conversation with your lender and just ask them if there's ways that you can restructure any of your loan agreements to get more personal or favorable terms, particularly if you have personal guarantees. The general rule of thumb, you want to try to avoid, putting a personal guarantee against a business loan in any situation that you can. And so if you have a personal guarantee on a loan right now, maybe there's an opportunity for you to remove that. So again, just start a conversation with your banker and see if there's things that can be done to take advantage of the favorable lending market right now. All right, so that's that. I'll kick it over to John here to talk about the last section on some governance considerations. You're on mute, John. Good team.
Can you hear me now? All right. I just want to say one thing about the personal guarantees, and that is if you find yourself in a situation where the bank is absolutely requiring a personal guarantee, do not be afraid to shop around. Many times this is a bank policy, and you'll find with possibly even the larger banks that they're willing to waive that requirement. So just don't be stuck if you hear you have to have a personal guarantee. That is not always true. That's not a legal requirement. I've heard banks say that before. Oh, we're legally required to have a personal guarantee. That's not generally the case, and so don't be afraid to shop around. All right, on the governance thing, I want to talk to you a little bit about governance and why that it's important. If you've ever heard the term piercing the veil, that means that a court decided not just to hold the organization liable for something, but to hold the individuals behind the organization liable. Perhaps it's the members, the partners, the owners, the shareholders, whatever it may be. And so I'm going to talk to you about kind of keeping your governance up during this strange time. And honestly, in the future, as more people work remotely, because I really feel like this is going to be a bit of a cultural change for us for a while, where more and more people are going to feel like they can work remotely and we're not going to have the traditional office culture that we've had in the past. And so let me tell you what I mean by governance. First of all, I'm talking about your governing documents, which could be any of these items that you see on your screen. In Texas, it's called a certificate of formation. It used to be called articles of incorporation, and almost every other state is called articles of incorporation. In Texas, it's your certificate of formation, your bylaws, your membership agreement, your partnership agreement, your company agreement also could be called your operating agreement, and your shareholder agreement, which usually goes with the corporation along with bylaws and the certificate of formation. And so these documents tell you how to run the formalities of the organization that you're in. So what are some things that you need to be aware of? Well, first of all, almost all of these documents in state law is going to require annual meetings. And there have been a lot of annual meetings missed over the last 9 months due to COVID-19. And honestly, they've been forgotten altogether. People are just saying, oh, well, we'll meet again someday. So don't forget that you have to have an annual meeting. This can be problematic for a couple of reasons. One, if you're any type of membership organization, whether a nonprofit or otherwise, then members could demand that you have an annual meeting, and you have roughly 60 days, 61 days, in some days, the 61st day, to have an annual meeting. So you can literally have one person hijack your corporation if you have members and demand an annual meeting if you're not having them. And so this can be embarrassing. It can be a little bit scary. So you need to make sure you're having your annual meetings if you're required to have them. The other thing is a lot of these annual meetings must be in person unless your bylaws say or your managing documents say that the annual meetings can be electronic or not in person. And the requirements for this is that everyone has to have the ability to participate. So if you have a large membership or you have a large shareholder collection, everyone must be able to participate. This can cause chaos. if you're not prepared for it. And so you need to be aware of what your documents say. Do the documents allow for electronic meeting? If they do, can everyone participate? So this is really something that you need to pay attention to. Again, if you're a for-profit, maybe you have officers and managers. Have they been appointed appropriately? Are they acting within their grounds? If you have a limited liability company, you have a couple members who are owners. The state law usually calls them members. And then you have managers that manage the organization. You may be surprised if you look back at your governing documents. If you just got a form or your lawyer just gave you a form and didn't really sit down and talk to you about what your goals were, you may be surprised at the amount of authority that the manager has for the organization. In fact, the owners, the members may only have the ability to replace the manager and dissolve or merge the company. That may be their only ability. Everything else from a day-to-day business may be completely relying on the officers or completely relying on the managers, depending on your governing documents. So during this time when we're not having meetings or people are not keeping up with the formalities, you need to go back and look and see what authority does everyone have? Are they operating inside that authority? Or is it time for the shareholders or the members and the managers to hold a meeting? The other thing that I'm seeing during this time is I'm seeing appointments, commissions, whatever you want to call it, term limits, expire without anyone doing anything. I was in a board meeting a couple months ago where every single board member's term had expired, and they weren't aware of it. It had expired during the last couple of years. They weren't aware of it. No one had done anything. And let me tell you what this can do. If this can ultimately start to hold people personally liable. If these directors are out signing loan documents and they're not a director of the organization, the bank can come in and say, hey, not only holding the organization liable, but these guys signed it in their personal capacity because they weren't really directors of an organization. Now, I understand there's arguments for and against that, but you don't want to be in a situation where a bank is coming after you personally because someone forgot to bring up a reappointment in a board meeting. So these sorts of things can be addressed with changes to bylaws, maybe changing board limits, term limits, expanding them, or just keeping up with a regular agenda. I have an agenda that I give my clients and say, hey, this is your annual meeting agenda. Make sure once a year you cover all of these topics. And they talk about the director's reappointments, the officer's reappointments. If the officers did something that the board agrees with, we ratify those things. We even if we didn't give appropriate approval because we didn't have a meeting, but we think it's for the good of the organization, we ratify that. And then the other thing is during the last 9 months, things come to light is the limit on spending that officers or managers or individuals who run organizations may have. They may have a small spending limit and they were supposed to go to the board with everything else and they didn't do that. Maybe this is taking out a loan where, hey, pandemic or the last few months caused people to sell property and the officers and the managers got together and said, hey, this is some great property for sale. What a great deal. Let's hurry up and buy it real quick. And the directors will be thrilled to know this at our next board meeting, but they didn't have the authority to do that. That can be a problem for them if the directors decide not to ratify that decision, think that it was wrong. Now, I know I've been talking a lot about what's happened the last 9 months of the pandemic, but really all of these things are valid if you have a culture where people are meeting less and less or working from home more and more. There are things that you really need to be thinking about. So think about your governance documents. If you need help interpreting them or reviewing them or revising them, certainly let me know or contact your attorney for sure. So thanks for that. Mia, you want to wrap us up?
Thanks, John. Yes, thanks, Brian. So interestingly enough, Brian, what you mentioned about the payroll tax fraud, that is an area that we here at Payroll Partners see a lot of new clients to us may be coming to us because they discovered fraud or inaccuracies either by their in-house accounting or even sometimes maybe by their CPA who doesn't understand clergy tax or whatever the case might be. And in regards to the compliance, John, when you were mentioning the applications and tax documents, I-9s, W-4s, of course, we are a payroll service, but we also offer a great HR cloud-based platform that gives you a complete workforce solution so you can do payroll, timekeeping, as well as manage those documents electronically through onboarding and gather signatures on your own internal documents that you want as you're maybe creating these new procedures and policies as your organization is going through these changes. So thank you guys so much, John and Brian. We do have a few questions and we have a few minutes. So let me start with Brian. Do you have a suggestion for a purchase limit on credit cards, or is there a standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's going to depend a little bit, like from organization to organization, but I think somewhere in the 250 to $500 range is kind of a general rule of thumb when it comes to a limit on an individual employee credit card. Because if we think about it, for most employees, credit cards are kind of used for incidental purchases. It's a mentor lunch, or it's a meal with a customer, or they're traveling and they're going to be paying for things that incidental type purchases. If there's going to be a large purchase of some new sound equipment or something like that's of a bigger size, there should be that pre-approval in place so that they first get approval to make the purchase in advance of actually doing it. And so what a lot of organizations will do is have a smaller general limit on each of one of their cards. And then when an employee turns in a request to make an expense purchase that's larger, then they can go in and increase the limit on that card to allow them to make the purchase, and then the limit gets dropped back down. We've seen one organization in particular, a nonprofit organization that had around $100 million budget and had like 400 employee credit cards floating around out there, and every single one of them had a $200 limit on it. And so not one of those employee credit cards could purchase more than $200 worth of anything at one given time without there being, a supervisor who temporarily increases the limit. So good question.
Okay. And is there a way to automate credit card purchases or the
yeah, so
approvals,
there's a lot of tools out there. Expensify is one that comes to mind. That's a very basic. It's kind of like the QuickBooks version of. It's not a QuickBooks product, but it's like the QuickBooks type product that's just going to be widely applicable to almost anybody. That's Expensify. Concur is the bigger boy product that a lot of like Fortune 500 companies will use, but they all kind of work the same way. Nexonia is another one where you have an application on your phone. Whenever John and I go to lunch for a business meal, when I get the receipt for that lunch, I snap a picture of it, and the app goes in and it'll capture the date, the dollar amount, the place that we ate, and then all I have to do is go in and say, John and I met to discuss, whatever business transaction or whatever. And then at the end of the month, that product will pull all those things together and put together an expense report that'll show expense by expense what was purchased, and then include the PDF of the receipt that was taken, send it all in a nice, neat package to the accountant. You can even go so far as to integrate that with your accounting system to where, that will post into accounts payable, and it just kind of takes all the manual journal entry as well as the manual tracking of paper, takes that all out of the equation.
Okay, great. I'm sure that was great information. And then the last question I had for you, Brian, was do you suggest dual signatures on all checks?
Dual signatures kind of seem like a good control, but the reality is, most bankers will tell you that banks do not check dual signatures. And so it's kind of common. We'll see, any check over $10,000 has to have two signatures. That gives us some comfort. But banks will tell you that the banks are not going to make sure that there's a two signatures on every check over a certain dollar limit. They're just not going to take, the time to do that. And so it's kind of a false sense of security, if you will. Good concept, but not always a good solution when it comes to practice.
Okay, interesting. Okay, and we have a couple for you, John. I think this is geared towards hourly employees that are working from home. How do you keep them from working extra, I guess? And also, how do you monitor the hours that they're working?
Absolutely. So, legally, the employer is responsible for keeping time records. So, even though the employee may punch the clock or turn in their hours, it's actually all of that responsibility is on the employer. The problem with that is when there's a dispute, how many hours are being worked. If the employee says, "Hey, I'm working a lot of hours here," and it can be really confusing when you've got a situation where they're working from home and maybe the lines are really blurred. They may be coming into the office, they have access to their desktop. Well, now they're at home with a laptop, and now they can answer email at any point during the day. And so someone who's hourly may be working from 9 to 5, but now they've got 5 or 6 emails between 7 and 11 at night. Well, that's just a string of emails that the government is going to say they need to be paid for, and is going to count toward overtime for them possibly. And so you need to really have a system that you're comfortable with, that the employee's logging into, clocking in and clocking out. And then you can absolutely enforce how much time they're able to work. You can tell them no overtime is approved, or no more than 35 hours a week is approved. But if they work over that, they must be paid for it. Now, you can terminate an employee for working too much time when you told them not to, but you still must pay them for the time that they worked. And so it's very, very important that you're very clear. You document exactly how much time you're allowing them to work. If no overtime is approved, you make that clear. But if they happen to work it, you've got to pay it out. You must pay that overtime rate to them. You can't come back and say, "Well, it wasn't approved. Sorry." That's not going to cut it. You've absolutely got to pay it.
Okay, that is good information as well. You got to pay it, and then you can figure out what to do about it. So this comes down to the bylaw meetings, I guess, right now that might be all virtual. How do they change the bylaws if they can't have an in-person meeting? And then what if someone refuses to come to the meeting? Well, I guess it'd be whether it be virtually or in person.
Most bylaws should allow for what we call an action without a meeting. And in this kind of situation, as long as it's unanimous, you can make changes to anything through writing. So you can actually email out a resolution. As long as it's unanimous, everyone signs, then you can go ahead and make those changes without actually having a meeting. And you can even change the bylaws if your bylaws allow it. If they don't, then you need to think about how to have a meeting in accordance with CDC guidelines and actually having an in-person meeting. So there's a couple different ways there. If you need help thinking about it, or you feel like you're stuck, call a lawyer, and they can kind of help you work through the business organizations codes and what the requirements are for you. If you have someone that's absolutely refusing to come to a meeting, that's okay. Meetings do not require unanimous attendance from everyone. They only require a quorum. And so you can actually get something done without everybody in the room, so long as the quorum has been met. And that's different based on what your governing documents say and what Texas law says if you leave it unaddressed. So, but usually it at least has to be a majority of the people eligible to vote would be a good quorum. And so something to think about. But if someone refuses to come to a meeting, hey, it's too high risk, I'm not getting out. That doesn't mean that your meeting's hijacked and you can't have it. It just means they may not be able to be there. But it also means that you need to be very careful in following the procedure for having a meeting and making sure that everyone who does come counts toward that quorum. Another thing to do that is often forgotten in board meetings and member meetings is waiving of notice. Your bylaws need to state that if you show up to a meeting, you've waived the notice requirements. You're saying, hey, I'm here, so I'm not going to complain later that I wasn't getting plenty of notice, unless they come specifically for that reason and say, I was not given enough time to prepare. I'm complaining that I wasn't given enough notice, then that would be another issue. But you need to think about those notice requirements for your meetings as well.
Okay. Well, guys, we are wrapping up right on time. I don't see any more questions as of right now. John, thank you so much. Of course, if anybody needs some more help with employment law or any other areas of business, I'm sure he can help you with his group. And Brian, did you have anything you wanted to add before we sign off?
No, I think we're
Great.
good. We appreciate the opportunity. Thanks for being with us.
We appreciate
Yeah,
everybody
thank you,
joining.
everyone.
We will have another session in January. Look for the topic to be announced soon. I do apologize for the technical difficulties. My computer was just deciding to do things on its own there for a little bit. So appreciate everybody joining and being patient. And thanks everyone so much. Bye, guys.
Thank you. Take care.